The Quran famously denies the crucifixion of Jesus. I'm going to see if the claim of the Quran stands up against historical scrutiny and the scrutiny of modern scholars on the life of Jesus. So we see in Surah chapter 4, verse 157, it says, "And for their saying, indeed we have killed the Messiah, Jesus the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them, and indeed those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of assumption, and they did not kill him for certain." So here we can clearly see the Quran is claiming that Jesus did not die by crucifixion. But let's see what the actual historical data says on the life of Jesus and see if the Quran is a valuable source with regards to the life of Jesus or not. So we can see in Matthew chapter 27, verse 32 to 38, it says, As they were going out, they found a Cyrene man named Simon. They forced him to carry the cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they gave him wine mixed with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he refused to drink it. After crucifying him, they divided his clothing by casting lots. Then they sat down and were guarding him there. Above his head, they put the charge against him in writing, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 criminals were crucified with him, one on the right and the other on the left. The Gospel of Mark says in 15:20 through 27, it says, "After they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and put his clothes on him. They led him out to crucify him. And they forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothing, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge written against him was the King of the Jews. They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and the other on his left." The Gospel according to Luke in 23:32-34, it says, two other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they are doing." And they divided his clothing and cast lots. Now, there's an important aspect we need to hit here as well with regards to, of course, Luke affirms the crucifixion of Christ, which is not surprising. But the other thing we need to note for our Muslim friends is that Jesus calls Allah his Father. Now, Muslims can never call Allah their Father in any sense, because Allah makes clear in Surah chapter 19, verse 93, that anyone who comes to Allah will come only as a slave. So the only relationship somebody can have in relationship to the God of the Quran is a slave to master relationship. Let's continue on and see what the Gospel of John says on this account. It says in John chapter 19, verse 16 through 20, it says, "Then he handed him over to be crucified. Then they took Jesus away, carrying the cross by himself. He went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Then they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a sign made and put on the cross. It said, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek." So we can clearly see here the earliest biographies on the life of Jesus all affirm that Jesus did indeed die by crucifixion. We can continue on and see what other historical records have to say on this point. We can see the Jewish historian Josephus saying of Jesus, "Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among them, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him reappear to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. So here we can clearly see that Josephus affirms that Jesus died by crucifixion. Let's continue on. We can look at Tacitus, a Roman historian. He says in his Annals, it says, such indeed were the persecutions of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek the means of propitiating the gods, and records were added to the sublime books, by the direction of which prayers were offered to Vaticus, Ceres, and Puna. Juno, too, was entreated by the matrons in the capital. Then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured to sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess. And there were sacred banquets and nightly vigils, celebrating by married women, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods, that the conflagration of a result of an order, consequently to get rid of this report with regards to the burning of Rome, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which is translated as Christ, from whom their name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, which is crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, the subject for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, speaking of the resurrection, but again in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful for every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty therein. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and spears, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. So here we can clearly see that Tacitus does affirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. Next, we can see Lucian of Samosata. He was a satirist around 125 to 180 AD. He says, Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. So we can clearly see that he does affirm that Jesus was crucified. Since you see these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them, and then it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage. Once again, he notices, or he makes mention that they worship the crucified sage, which would of course be Jesus in this passage. It says, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. Let's continue on. Next, we can see Marabar Cyprian. He's a philosopher. It says, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? Speaking of Jesus, it was just after that the kingdom was abolished. Speaking of the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. It says, God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samaritans were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews ruined and driven from their land, living complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teachings which he had given. Let's continue on. We can also see Thales, who was said to have written around 52 AD. Now, we need to understand, though, we don't have any of his works, but we do have a quote by other writers. One of the writers is Julius Africanus, who tells us that Thales was trying to explain away the darkness and earthquake that followed Jesus' death by crucifixion. It reads as follows: "On the whole world there passed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. The darkness Thales in the third book of history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." Now, what in the world is he talking about? He's talking about this from the Gospel of Matthew. It says in Matthew chapter 27, verse 53, 50 through 53, it says, "Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. The tombs also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, entered the holy city, and appeared to many." So here we can clearly see that Thales is trying to connect, or trying to refute the issue of the darkness over the land as reported by the Gospel of Matthew. Now we're going to look at what the modern critical scholars say who study the life of Jesus for a living. So we need to understand that the historical Jesus studies is a science that attempts to determine what can be known of Jesus on the basis of historical research alone. That is, though the analysis of data pertaining to Jesus is in accord with the same standards that would be employed when analyzing data pertaining to any other figure from antiquity. Such analysis is supposed to be free of religious or anti-religious bias, and scholars engaged in this field call each other to task when they suspect that one's conclusions have been influenced by personal predication. The scholars frequently maintain that they are not trying to discover what might be true of Jesus, but what is verifiable. And it's also important to realize that the scholars who are part of this field is not required to be a Christian in order to be a part of this group of people. So we're going to see what the critical scholars have to say on the life of Jesus. Gerhard Ludemann says, "The fact of the death of Jesus as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Despite hypothesis of pseudo-death, which is definitely the Quran, or a deception, which are sometimes put forward, it need not be discussed here further." So here clearly, Gerhard Ludemann is explicitly saying that Jesus died by crucifixion as opposed to some other pseudo-death theory, and that there's no question about it. Let's continue on and see what we find next. Paula Fredrickson says, "The single most solid fact we have about about Jesus' life is his death. Jesus was crucified. Thus, Paul, the Gospels, Josephus, Tacitus, the evidence does not get any better than this." We can see Bart Ehrman, who Muslims love to use against Christians, but he says that Jesus had died by crucifixion is almost universally attested in our sources, early and late. We can also see John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can be. Marcus Borg says Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. So we looked at several pieces of historical data, and we came to the conclusion that based on the historical data and the testimony of critical scholars, that Jesus did indeed die by crucifixion. So Muslims, every shred of evidence on the life of Jesus is against you here with regards to the crucifixion of Christ. So what are you going to do? Are you going to cling to this hopeless verse that says that somebody else was crucified in his place? Or are you actually going to be real with yourself for once and realize that the Quran and the God of Islam is lying to you? And whenever you come to that realization, I want you to know that you have somewhere to turn. You can turn to Jesus, and you can come out of darkness into his marvelous light.